All right, welcome to Class 5. For today, we read an essay by T. Nguyen on echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. So this is a work in social epistemology. As I've been emphasizing, there are three main approaches to teaching critical thinking. The traditional philosophical approach and the psychological approach are the two most common ones. But a third approach based on social epistemology is something that I'm introducing for this semester. And it's actually precisely because of essays like this that I'm making this change, because I'm becoming more and more convinced that the traditional ways of teaching critical thinking just aren't up to the task of explaining a lot of current political conflict and dysfunction and disinformation and conspiracy theories and that sort of thing. So actually I want to start with a tweet that I encountered a while back. I thought was funny and accurate. Bama Fangirl tweeted, "Y'all remember before the internet that people thought the cause of stupidity was a lack of access to information? Yeah, it wasn't that." Yeah, I'm old enough that I remember, in fact, the tech boom of the 90s, all of the promises made about human enlightenment that would be brought about by access to information. And, well, yeah, that hasn't happened. And some of that was predictable because access to information is also access to disinformation. But it turns out that, well, simply trying to promulgate the tools of distinguishing information from disinformation haven't been adequate because we don't really understand why people are drawn to disinformation unless we use the tools of social epistemology. So this essay by Nguyen was one of the first essays that really began to convince me that this was an important issue to pursue and to use in shaping my classes. I had you do an exercise, and some of the exercise was just like, helping to confirm that you did the reading, you digested the material. So I wanted you to distinguish echo chambers from epistemic bubbles, come up with an example, and put some of Nguyen's argument in standard form. So in this video, part of what I'm going to be doing is answering the first and third of these questions. I'm going to be talking about the difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers and outlining Nguyen's main argument that our current problems are caused by echo chambers and not epistemic bubbles. I will leave the middle question, thinking of more examples, to you. The ability to come up with more examples is a really good sign that you have properly absorbed the material. Another thing I'm going to be doing is, in this video, is discussing how to tell if you are in an echo chamber and looking critically at some of Nguyen's thoughts on how people can get out of echo chambers. So the first main insight of Nguyen's paper is that there's a difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, and that a lot of people writing about current political conflicts have not distinguished these two ideas when they really, really need to. Basically, an epistemic bubble is a situation where a person holds a false belief because they don't come into contact with opposing viewpoints or information that contradict their views. So just remember, the definition of epistemology is the study of knowledge, what it is and how to get it. We've been talking about social epistemology, so that's the study of how in groups we acquire knowledge or fail to acquire knowledge. So an epistemic bubble is a knowledge bubble, an information bubble. And so complaints about information bubbles is the sort of thing that you see a lot of people writing about social media voicing. The claim is that our main social media feeds are all tailored to our politics, and so we never get to hear other voices, other sides of the debate, and that makes us polarized, and that is why people claim so many people are angry all the time. Nguyen points out that this is actually very different than an echo chamber. In an echo chamber, people do hear voices from the other side, but they discount them because they don't trust them. The problems that we are facing really come from echo chambers, not epistemic bubbles. So bottom line, an epistemic bubble is when you don't hear the people from the other side. An echo chamber is what happens when you don't trust people from the other side. Most people writing on contemporary politics aren't making this distinction, so that they think people are in epistemic bubbles when they really are in echo chambers. A lot of what Nguyen is doing here is drawing on a 2008 book by Jameson and Capella that's called Echo Chamber. It is about Rush Limbaugh and right-wing media in general. And the book documents how people like Limbaugh and Fox News systematically cultivate distrust in other news and information sources. They don't isolate people from these sources, however. They and their followers routinely read and quote people who disagree with them, but they do this in order to denounce them as liars and deceivers. So again, the issue here isn't about contact, it's about a lack of trust. And one of the things that actually happens here is the development of what Nguyen labels a disagreement reinforcement mechanism. That's fancy. It's got some other names. But the basic idea here is that if you really want to get people loyal to you and distrustful of other people, you want to give them a set of beliefs that will make them treat any contradictory evidence as more evidence for their own worldview. So what they say is that Limbaugh says, the liberal media is going to lie to you. This is a thing the liberal media is saying. This is a lie. And so when his followers encounter these statements, it actually proves Limbaugh correct, because he made this prediction about how the liberal media would distort their views. And this is something that actually, this kind of reinforcement mechanism is something that you see all over the place. So you can imagine members of a religious group. In fact, many religious groups will warn their members about outsiders who are trying to tempt them or undermine their faith. Sometimes this process is called evidential preemption. You are essentially trying to inoculate your followers against the negative evidence that they are going to encounter in the world. And social psychology tells us that there are all sorts of mechanisms that people have that cause them to double down on their current beliefs in the face of negative evidence. Because after all, encountering negative evidence, admitting you're wrong is painful. So rather than admit you're wrong, you double down on your false beliefs. And then disagreement reinforcement mechanisms are tools that you can use to win loyalty by exploiting these features of people's psychology. Sometimes I should say Nguyen links this to cults. I actually don't like the language of cult. I think there are abusive things that happen in religious contexts, but they are just as likely to happen in mainline religions as they are in new emerging religions and religions that seem odd to mainline people. So I rather than talking about cults, I much prefer to talk about religious abuse. And the use of disagreement reinforcement mechanisms happens in bad in religious abuse situations, both in mainstream religions and in unusual religions. Okay, so an echo chamber. Actually, in this version of the article, Nguyen creates a more detailed definition of an echo chamber. This article is actually an extension of a more popular article that he wrote for the online magazine Eon. This one extends it and makes it more academic, more suitable for a college audience rather than a popular audience. The original article is called "Why It's as Hard to Escape an Echo Chamber as It Is to Escape a Cult." But in any case, one of the things he adds in this extended version is a more detailed look at what it means to be in an echo chamber. And so the basic property is the first one that I list here. An echo chamber creates a significant disparity of distrust between members and non-members, right? You are in an echo chamber if there's a group of people that you systematically distrust that are outside of your group. And the echo chamber will exclude non-members through epistemic discrediting, that is, saying that they're not trustworthy, while simultaneously amplifying the members' epistemic credentials. So the constant message in an echo chamber is, you cannot trust outsiders, but you can trust us absolutely. And another important feature here is that this echo chambers work for groups where having certain beliefs is a prerequisite for membership in the group. So you can think about how, there are all sorts of different human groups out there. And some of them you just belong to whether you like it or not, and it doesn't matter what you believe. So racial groups are like that. If you are born black or white, everyone is going to categorize you. You can try and opt out of it, but you'll get a lot of resistance, and there are no belief requirements for being in the group. Religions, on the other hand, typically have belief requirements for being in them, and so do echo chambers, right? And the unique thing about echo chambers is that not only are there beliefs that you have to be in the group, but those very beliefs are the things that amplify the distrust between in-group members and out-group members. So so you can think about this in a religious context. If your religious sect teaches that you've got things to learn from members of all religions, then that's not a disagreement reinforcement mechanism. That's not an echo chamber. That is a sign that you're not in a dysfunctional or abusive context. Whereas if it becomes core to being a member of your religion that you distrust members of other religions, that is a sign of, among other things, religious abuse, but also an echo chamber. So I think actually this gives us the first hint on how we can tell when we are in an echo chamber. Nguyen mentions that echo chambers can create runaway credence levels for approved individuals. That's kind of fancy, but what that just means is the reinforcement mechanisms lead you to trust the leaders more and more and more, and eventually you wind up having infinite trust in them. In healthy epistemic communities, that is, healthy communities of knowers, there is something like an upper ceiling on the credence level afforded to any individual. That is, there's an upper limit to how much you're ever going to put your boundless faith in someone, right? Any one individual. And this is because your trust in other people as sources of knowledge is spread widely across many different kinds of individuals, and this allows you to get input from many different kinds of individuals, and more importantly, to be willing to consider it fairly. So that's the difference between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. The next step is to understand why echo chambers and not epistemic bubbles are the major problem we're facing. But before we do that, we need to say a little bit about how epistemic bubbles and echo chambers are broken down, are gotten rid of. I'll be returning to this at the end of the video when I have more to say about escaping an echo chamber. But right now, I just want to provide the initial contrast, right? So basically, to pop an epistemic bubble, all you need to do is expose people to the required information, the outside sources that they haven't been previously exposed to. To get rid of an echo chamber, you need to do something far more complicated. You need to rebuild trust. Actually, I think Nguyen is a little optimistic when he says that all you need to do to pop an epistemic bubble is expose people to outside information. Because there are things that are not a part of echo chambers that keep us clinging to false beliefs that we've already established. And the big one here is just confirmation bias. So you are going to be subject to confirmation bias even if you're not in an echo chamber, right? Confirmation bias is just your tendency to ignore evidence that doesn't fit with what you already believe. The echo chamber is a social structure that is constantly reinforcing your natural confirmation bias. But even in the absence of an echo chamber, you're still going to be subject to confirmation bias. Nevertheless, I think Nguyen is basically right that it is significantly easier to pop an epistemic bubble than it is to escape an echo chamber, because in an echo chamber, you've got all of those individual factors like confirmation bias that are being exploited and reinforced by the leadership of the group that you are in. To break through an echo chamber, you need to rebuild trust. You can't just, this can't be done with information. It can't be done with argument. Ultimately, and this is why I think this is a problem for critical thinking courses, it can't be done with reason alone. And so Nguyen relies on one particular story of a white supremacist who was deprogrammed, essentially weaned away from his white supremacist upbringing by consistent, persistent, generous outreach by Jewish people at his college. There are other stories that in other situations that are very similar. So there's during the early part of the 21st century, during the aughts, there was a lot of research, not a lot, there was some research on deprogramming Islamic radicals. This was obviously something that the U.S. government had a big interest in. And the consistent result was that you needed to give people something emotionally that replaces what belief in violent jihad used to do for them. This is actually, and this is true for conspiracy theories. It's true for QAnon. You need to address why people are drawn into these radical beliefs and social structures, right? So you need to rebuild trust, and that is hard. So epistemic bubbles are easier to pop than echo chambers. Why do we think our current problems are caused by echo chambers? Well, actually, all of the stuff that that Nguyen used to introduce the idea of echo chambers applies right away here, right? Rush Limbaugh has been or was a major political figure for decades, and he still exerts a big influence after his death. But all the stuff we heard from Jameson and Capella tells us that Limbaugh's followers regularly read but do not accept liberal news sources. So if the problem were merely an epistemic bubble, plus perhaps some confirmation bias, that would have been collapsed. But that's not what we see. And what Jameson and Capella observed for Limbaugh has been observed on other platforms as well, right? So new Facebook data, in fact, does seem to show that people on Facebook do see information from the other side. And people often visit websites with an opposite political affiliation. And there's a citation to that that I've got here that you can click on if you download the PowerPoint. So what we're seeing here is not an interruption in the flow of information. It is a lack of trust. And we can go ahead and now put this argument in standard form, right? Epistemic bubbles can be popped by exposure to contradictory evidence and argument. Facebook users, that's premise one. Premise two, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans are routinely exposed to contradictory evidence and arguments. Premise three, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans remain politically polarized. Conclusion, Facebook users and Rush Limbaugh fans are not trapped in epistemic bubbles. There must be something else going on, and that is the echo chamber. So, echo chambers do a better job than epistemic bubbles of explaining why so many people seem to have become irrational and ignore evidence, right? In fact, people in echo chambers are using critical reasoning. They just have distorted standards of who to trust. So I've given examples in the past where it looks like people are making crazy inferences. For instance, I talked about the QAnon followers who believed that they were exposed to anthrax. But this is actually an example of the use of critical reasoning if you recognize that they are completely wedded to the premise that COVID is fake, right? So the problem is not a failure to reason, but bad relationships of trust that then distort the process of reasoning. And there's another point that Nguyen makes that I think is worth thinking about. Echo chambers don't use Orwellian doublespeak. So I don't know if you were made to read 1984 or any George Orwell in high school or other classes. I recommend that you do. It's great stuff. Orwell has spends a lot of time criticizing bureaucratic language for hiding atrocities, and in particular he's thinking about Stalin and Hitler. Hiding atrocities behind nice words, right? Orwellian doublespeak. But we don't see Orwellian doublespeak in the current environment coming from the radicalized sources. The radicalized sources state clearly who can be trusted and who can't. And so in the past, I've used Orwell in this course, and I've talked about how a lot of the language around immigrant detention is examples of Orwellian doublespeak. But I don't believe that is the problem when we are looking at vaccine denial or QAnon or similar right-wing movements. So for the last part of this video, I want to return to the question of how to escape from an echo chamber. Because I think, practically speaking, this is the most important question. If Nguyen and Jameson and Capella are right, and many people are caught in echo chambers, this is the question that we face practically. And also, this is a question that can apply to all kinds of echo chambers. Nguyen emphasizes that echo chambers happen everywhere. This isn't just an accusation that's being hurled at right-wing media. Echo chambers happen around diets, right, or CrossFit, that sort of thing. So this is an important practical question. And Nguyen breaks it down into two separate questions, which I think is nice. First, there's the question of whether it is possible at all to escape an echo chamber. And then there's the question of whether it might be so difficult that we wouldn't reasonably expect anyone to do it, right? And the way Nguyen puts this question is in terms of epistemic responsibility, that is, your responsibility to be a critical thinker. It may be that it's just so difficult to escape an echo chamber that we can't really expect anyone to do it. He's kind of, he's hesitant about this. He does make a few concrete claims. So first of all, intentionally creating echo chambers is morally and epistemically blameworthy. And if Jameson and Capella are right, then Rush Limbaugh did exactly this. However, you can't always be blamed for being in an echo chamber. Some people are born into echo chambers. Other times people enter them for completely innocuous reasons, wanting to belong to a group. It's one of the most powerful motivations there is. He also says that escape from an echo chamber can't happen one belief at a time, right? It's not a matter of being exposed to critical evidence, and it's not a matter of attacking individual beliefs. It needs to be a bigger and more fundamental process. So he's got one suggestion for escaping echo chambers, and he calls this a social epistemic reboot. This is an attempt to simultaneously consider the trustworthiness of all your sources of information. You can't attack the echo chamber one point at a time, so you need to completely reboot. And it needs to be a social reboot. That is, you need to be considering your trust of sources of information and also your distrust of other sources of information. So this is actually described as a social version of Descartes' method of radical doubt. Descartes is beloved and despised by philosophers. He's a philosopher you're likely to have heard of because he had this idea of radical doubt, where he tried to doubt all of his beliefs at once and then recreate his belief system from scratch. And Nguyen emphasizes that it's now commonly believed that Descartes failed at this. This wasn't a real, he couldn't really recreate his beliefs. And I want to expand on this a little. He really couldn't prove all of his beliefs from scratch. I want to expand on this a little by looking actually at two examples of this. So Descartes, in his book Meditations on First Philosophy in 1641, tried to imagine doubting everything. And then he famously came down to one core belief. He couldn't doubt his own existence because he was there thinking. So this is the famous "I think, therefore I am," right? And his claim was that starting with the simple premise that "I think, therefore I am," he could reconstruct all of his beliefs. So there's another thinker who went through a similar process that doesn't get talked about as much in American philosophy classes, but I think should. And this is Abu Hamid Muhammad ibn Muhammad al-Ghazali, more commonly just known as al-Ghazali. He was a Persian philosopher. He died in 1111, and near the end of his life, he wrote a book called Deliverance from Error, which was a kind of an autobiography. And in his autobiography, he describes going through the same thing that Descartes did, that is, trying to, feeling doubt for everything, and then trying to reconstruct his whole belief system from there, a kind of reboot. And so one interesting thing that both thinkers have in common is that they both doubted so much that they wondered, might I be in an illusion? Maybe everything around me is an illusion. Maybe I'm asleep and dreaming. These days we would use the Matrix, the Matrix movies, as a metaphor. So both Descartes and Al-Ghazali essentially asked themselves, how do I know I'm not living in the Matrix? And both of them wrote books sort of explaining how they, from the question, how do I know I'm not living in the Matrix, managed to rebuild all of their belief systems. And not surprisingly, really, they rebuilt their belief systems the way they were before. So Descartes, prior to his meditations on first philosophy, was a Roman Catholic. And starting with the premise, I think, therefore I am, he was able to somehow manage to prove the existence of God and the soul, which is actually the full title of his book, Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the immortality of the soul are demonstrated. So he went from thinking, might I be in the Matrix, to reaffirming all the tenets of his Catholic faith. Al-Ghazali did the same thing, except he did it with Sunni Islam, and in particular his own belief version of Sunni Islam, which is a Sufi belief, emphasizes a lot of mysticism. Couple interesting contrasts. Descartes presents this as a kind of a thought experiment that he reasons his way out of. Al-Ghazali presents this as a real crisis of faith from which he was delivered only by the grace of God alone. But those differences aren't really important for what I want to talk about now. I just want to talk about this in terms of whether or not you could use some kind of epistemic reboot like this to escape an echo chamber. And one of the things that I find most striking is that both Descartes and Al-Ghazali, in attempting to reboot, wound up exactly where they started. So this makes me even more pessimistic, perhaps, than Nguyen about the possibility of breaking down echo chambers once they develop. That leaves us in practical terms, with only the option of preventing more echo chambers from developing. And so now I want to go back to Nguyen's advice about Nguyen's observation about belief levels in echo chambers. In any reasonable system of belief, there's going to be an upper limit on how much you trust any one individual or any source of information. And so what we want to be sure to do is continue to develop epistemic communities where we not only encounter multiple forms of information, we are willing to trust people who are giving us information from multiple sources in order to prevent the formation of echo chambers. Because I personally am pessimistic that even a social epistemic reboot would allow someone to escape an echo chamber once they are embedded in it.